parte todo esté funcionando bien.
Buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos a esta sesión de la Maestría en Educación de la Universidad del Norte. En esta oportunidad estamos abriendo nuestras puertas para las personas que se encuentran interesados en conocer cómo son las clases de la Maestría en Educación. La Maestría en Educación es la modalidad investigativa y especialmente la clase que hoy van a presenciar es parte de la clase del énfasis de educación infantil. Entonces, hoy tenemos una clase un poco magistral debido a que, bueno, como la puerta está abierta, entonces vamos a tener diferentes perfiles y digamos que es más manejable este diálogo con el experto, pero digamos que cuando hay otros tipos de dinámicas en las clases, en donde hay talleres, clases virtuales, tenemos también actividades de trabajo de campo, aproximaciones a la investigación y diferentes metodologías. Entonces agradecemos a todos por su interés en este tema del día de hoy. Mi nombre es Elsa Escalante y soy la coordinadora de la Maestría en Educación y ante todo, muchísimas gracias por su asistencia. En el día de hoy vamos a tener, como les dije, esta masterclass o clase abierta. El título es La Educación Básica Primaria en los Estados Unidos, Historias y Perspectivas. En el día de hoy tenemos a una conferencista, una profesora internacional que nos viene acompañando en la Maestría en Educación. Entonces, en la Maestría en Educación tenemos a nuestros docentes de la Universidad del Norte, pero también tenemos participación de docentes de otros países con quien ya tenemos, digamos, conversaciones, trabajos conjuntos, y con Katy, que es nuestra invitada de hoy, pues ella tuvo la oportunidad de ir a la Universidad del Norte para desarrollar competencias en español y allá fue donde nos conocimos. Entonces, esta sesión de hoy va a ser en inglés, pero si ustedes quieren hacer alguna pregunta, yo con mucho gusto pues traduciré, o si no, Katy se decidirá si habla o no. Ella unas veces se lanza y otras veces que no. Ella, como todos en la vida, entonces ya saben que Katy pues tendrá la oportunidad de compartir con ustedes. Entonces, ¿quién es la doctora Tricarico? Ella es PhD en Curriculum and Instruction de University of Florida y es docente del programa de Elementary Education Program en la misma universidad. Actualmente, además, es la coordinadora del Master of Arts in Teaching and Elementary Education en la misma universidad. Entonces, digamos que es nuestra par en el programa de educación elemental que trabaja en conjunto con nosotros acá en el programa de educación, pero enfocado en educación infantil. Entonces, bueno, sin más, damos pues inicio a esta sesión. Muchísimas gracias a todos los presentes. Y bueno, Katy, te dejo con tu público y espero que todos disfruten esta experiencia de conocer cómo es la educación en educación elemental, en básica primaria en los Estados Unidos. Katy, so you're welcome. Welcome to our class. So this is your group. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. And let's see. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. As Elsa said, I can speak some Spanish. I can understand some Spanish, not too much, and I am very rusty. But I will have a few slides in Spanish that I will be scared to say, but I will try. Okay, here is a little bit about myself. I have my family here, my mom and my brother. The picture of me is actually in Santa Marta from when I came to Uninorte. I work at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida, and I have been there for almost 8 years. Okay, so my presentation tonight is going to be about the education system in the United States. I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about the first half of my presentation will be about the history of education in the US. And then the second half will be about public schools in Florida right now. Okay, so just some questions to start, and you all can speak out or put some comments in the chat, but what does education in Colombia look like for grade students who are grades kindergarten through 6th grade or ages 5 to 12? Let me see if I can get to the chat. Can all students go to school, or do they have to pay? Is it free? Prepare students for academic success. Basically the same here. We have some social goals that we also emphasize. So I will talk about those. Who decides the curriculum? Government pays for children at risk. Does the government decide what the curriculum is? Yes, okay, all right. Okay, government decides the curriculum. All right, in the United States, the answers to those questions have changed over time. And so we'll do a little bit of talking about the history. But when we talk about formal schooling in the United States, we mostly are talking about white students and especially white boys in the early times. Education in the United States has always been very segregated up until the past, I would say, 75 years. We have mostly educated white children, and then other ethnicities have had to fight for their rights to be students in our public schools. Girls, African-American children, and Indigenous or Native American children have had very different experiences. Okay, I'm gonna put this link, in the chat. If I can, let's see. And I would like for you all to watch a few minutes of it, if possible. Let me get to it. Because it shows a really good view of our education system. Let's see, I'm having trouble getting to it. I think, Elsa, last time it worked if I shared it.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea. So la idea es que Katy va a compartirnos un link sobre la historia de los Estados Unidos ahora. Y en el chat podemos utilizar el chat para hablar ya sea en inglés o en español. Si hay algún comentario en inglés, yo de manera simultánea estaré traduciendo, o sea que no se preocupen. Entonces los invitamos para que ustedes observen el video y nos hagan sus comentarios al respecto.
And it is long, but only watch 10 minutes.
Dura 10 minutitos, o sea que en 10 minutitos regresaremos para conversar.
Yes. Only watch video 1.
Ok, solamente van a mirar el video número 1 porque cuando les abren el link van a encontrar 6 videos como nos está diciendo nuestra compañera Brigitte y la idea es que revisen el número 1.
discouraged because there's some kind of founding principle of the country. Well, it's not. And that was a new, radical, crazy seeming idea. In the 13 colonies of pre-revolutionary America, only the larger towns in New England were required by law to build schools. Elsewhere, education was neither free nor public. There were schools at all, and many communities had them, and some didn't. There were schools because people in a particular town or village or section of a county decided they wanted to get together and sort of pool their resources and hire a teacher. And thus you have the famous stories about the teacher who was paid with 2 bushels of wheat and a half a cow or something like that. Some colonial parents paid a fee to send their youngest children to day schools. Have you ever seen those wonderful pictures of Mother Goose-like person with 3 or 4 kids clustered around her skirt? That's the romanticized view of the day school. It's probably something between learning your letters and learning some discipline and having what wasn't called daycare, but in fact was. Little children were given a horn book, printed copy of the alphabet, and a short prayer, mounted on wood, covered with transparent cow horn. Most schooling was closely linked to the Protestant Bible, brought by early settlers to the New World. In the Puritan colonies, one of the concerns was whether or not people would follow the laws of the state or God and the scriptures, so that in the teaching, a certain level of fear instilled in all children, and if they failed to obey authority, they were damned. The most common school book was the New England Primer, used by instructors to teach reading, and the Protestant Catechism. What's the legal condition in hell? I shall be dreadfully tormented. What company will be there? The devils, the multitude of sinners in the grave. If you should go to hell, how long must you continue there? Forever and ever. Some older boys went to grammar school, where they studied mathematics, Latin, and philosophy. Only the most privileged and the means to continue on to college and university. The major thrust of schooling was to preserve the status quo. 18th century schools were preparing children to take the place of their parents, to be like their parents. By the time of the Revolutionary War, the vast majority of Americans were educated just enough to read a newspaper and the Bible, and to read the text.
Okay, probably most people have watched at least the first little bit of the video. So I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the main people who were involved with the very beginnings of our education system. So let me share my screen again. Okay, so there were 2 men at this time who were most influential in getting our public education system up and running. The first was Thomas Jefferson, and he was our 3rd president. Let's see. Okay. He believed that all children, all white children, should have access to education for 3 years. So he felt that students should go to school just for 3 years, and their focus would be on reading, because he felt that if children knew how to read, then they would be equipped to be successful in society. After those first 3 years of school, he then would choose a few boys, or not he, but the schools would choose a few boys who were the smartest or the doing the best in school, and he would encourage them to go on for further education. So he was really looking for only the best and brightest to get the highest level of education. Again, this was just really white boys. The other person who was very influential in our school system was Horace Mann, and he is the person who our system really was modeled after. He felt that all children, boys and girls, should have access to free education. He thought that if all students went to the same school, then all of them would be able to participate in society, and it would equalize everybody. So rich children and poor children would go to the same school, they would get the same education, and then they would both be likely to be successful. He felt that getting a good education would make everybody equal. He also thought that education was needed for good citizens. He felt that everybody deserved an education, which would then help them participate in society, help them know how to vote, help them be politically engaged, and help them just participate in society. So ultimately, it was his idea to have that common school, and that was how our public school system got started. So the idea again is that all the white, mostly male students, whether they were rich or poor, would go to school and leave with equal opportunity. Over time, more and more children got access to our public school system. So you will see in a few minutes all of the ways that that happened and what schools were like for different groups over time. But I think that we would say it's still a dream for schools to be providing equal opportunity. We have a lot of inequality still in our schools. Some schools that are in very wealthy neighborhoods have a lot more resources and materials, and the buildings are much nicer. And the children in poorer neighborhoods don't have all of those things, and their schools are pretty run down. So even though that's kind of the dream that we aspire to, we haven't achieved it yet today. Okay, our schools have been trying to teach children to be successful academically, but we're also trying to meet the needs of the society from a social perspective. We provide lunch to children who are economically disadvantaged. We have before school programs and after school programs if children need someone to watch them while their parents are at work. Some of our schools are called community schools, and they provide healthcare. They have a doctor, sometimes a dentist, who also work at the school. That's not at every school, that's not very common, but there are schools in some neighborhoods set up that way. We have schools that provide English language programs for parents in the evenings after the kids go home, in case there are parents who need to learn English. We also teach sex education in schools. That's also a political issue because some policymakers don't want children to learn sex education and others do. So that's something that changes often, but it is part of the curriculum. It just depends on how much the kids learn. Are there any social issues that schools in Colombia try to address, do you think? I'm going back to my chat to see. let's see. Let's see, I can't quite tell. Let's see. Okay. Access for children at risk. Yeah, so that's common. Okay. All right, so over time, this is sort of how our schools have shifted. Oh, you have focus on nutrition? That's great. So the very beginning of our public schools in about 1820 to 1840, we were just developing our identity as a new country. So the big emphasis on our schools was patriotism and really getting children to understand what it means to be an American. They were teaching just why it's important to vote, why it's important to be involved, that kind of thing. As time went on and we started having more and more immigration, especially from Europe, we changed our curriculum a little bit. And there was a big push for teaching for industrialism, because we had a lot of factories at that time with the assembly line. And so children would learn how to kind of follow those kinds of rules with, you know, when the bell would chime, they would move from one place to another, they'd be standing in line, they'd be doing things very orderly to help prepare them for jobs after they finished schooling. We also had a lot of education in things like how to bathe, how to speak English. There was a big push towards Americanization and like getting all of the immigrants to sort of shed their native culture and become what they considered like true Americans. So they pushed a lot of English classes. They stopped teaching, or they stopped encouraging children to speak their home language and that kind of thing. In the 1920s to 1940s, that is, you know, after World War I and during and after World War II, we developed the high school. So at this time, children who were ages like 13 to 17 started to be required to go to school. Before that, they would finish much earlier. Then in the 50s to 80s, we had the Cold War. So again, we had another push towards Americanization and patriotism and really being a Christian nation, and all of that kind of got incorporated into the public schools. Right now, we're in this increased testing movement, and we'll get to this at the end of the presentation, but children here in the United States take standardized tests almost every year they're in school, starting from the time they're 6 years old. So there's a lot of pressure now for those standardized testing. Yeah, testing is absolutely crazy here. It's one of the things that I like the least about our school system. Okay, so teachers also had a lot to do with this. We've almost at the very beginnings, you might have seen from the video, teachers were men at first. And then for when we started having school for young children, we started having more women taking those positions because the school districts felt that women could be more nurturing. And so they wanted women to work with the little children so that they could care for them. But then when they got into upper grades, the teachers were mostly men because they felt that men were the subject experts and they knew math better and they knew science better and they knew history better. So they wanted the men to be teaching those grades and the women just to be teaching the young ones. Over time, that has changed. And now we have teachers who are doing a lot of those nurturing things, but also trying to make sure that children have equal access to education. And we've really opened up the role of the teacher to be more than just a nurturer, but somebody who really is teaching children to be like a whole child. Okay, so one of the things that we notice here is that whoever is in office, whoever is the governor, whoever is the president, whoever is on the school board, they make a lot of decisions that are very political. And so what happens in the schools often shifts based on whoever is the person in power. I imagine that's probably the same in Colombia. Here, their belief systems, their personal beliefs often influence the policy that they create. So for example, there's a big debate about whether schools should teach evolution as a scientific theory, or if they should teach evolution and creationism together as equally feasible outcomes. So there are school boards who, like, if they really believe in creationism, then they'll put up a pretty strong fight and they'll like minimize the ways that teachers can teach evolution, or they'll prevent teachers from saying that evolution is, you know, basically the scientific, like the accurate scientific theory that explains, you know, human development over time. So if the people in power have a certain belief system, a lot of times you'll find that that school district also teaches things that follow that one person's belief system, depending on what position they have. A lot of times, like, our two biggest states are Texas and California. So those states have a lot of control over what textbooks get, what content textbooks have across the whole country. So Texas is a very conservative state. California is a very liberal state. The textbooks, if you were to put a California design textbook and a Texas design textbook next to each other, you would see a lot of differences in what content area gets emphasized, what like national and even global leaders get included in the textbooks. There have been disputes about whether to include, I'm not sure, whether to include certain people. So Harriet Tubman was someone who was very influential with the Underground Railroad here to help people escape slavery. There's some states where you would find her in the textbook, and there's other states where you wouldn't see mention of her at all, depending on who in the state has the power to make those decisions. So depending on where a student lives could really change the content that they are exposed to, based on, you know, what the political nature of that state is. Okay, so some of the issues that are more political hotspots, especially right now, early childhood education is a big question right now. Our new president wants to have early childhood education available to all children in the country, and there are a lot of people who don't want that. Because they don't want the government to be in charge of schools. But that's a weird argument, because the government already provides free education to all children ages 5 to 18. So I'm not sure really why it would matter to add a year or two to the front side of that and have it be from 3 or 4 to 18. But there are people who are fighting against it. Sex education is always very political. Common prayer time, we have a separation between church and state, so that you can pray on your own if you're in school, but there's not like an organized prayer time. And there are some politicians who want there to be an organized time for prayer. And some of our like legal defense teams say that that is going against the Constitution, because you can't require people to pray. So that's a hot topic issue in our country. Like I said before, teaching evolution or creationism. We have some issues right now going on with LGBTQ students. There are some states that are trying to ban transgender students from participating in sports. Because they're claiming that a trans girl shouldn't be competing on the girls' team, but they can't compete on the boys' team either. So it excludes those students altogether. So I'm expecting that's going to be going to the courts pretty soon, because states are starting to ban trans students from sports. And then another one is school meals and the kinds of food that should be served at school meals. Now, I have eaten in school cafeterias here in the US. I also ate at the school cafeteria with you at Uninorte, and the food that you all are served is so much more nutritious than the food that our students here are served. Most of the food here that students get in the cafeteria is not homemade at all. It's all packaged and heated up just in the oven. It's not anything that's prepared fresh. I remember when I was there, I would have eaten in that cafeteria every day for the rest of my life and been happy. But I choose not to eat here in our schools because the food is just not very good and it's not very healthy for the children either. So these are the issues right now that are sort of the hot button issues nationwide. Does anyone have any questions or comments so far? Please feel free to, put comments in the chat. I was going to have us take a break, but I would really like for people to chime in about those issues. Problems with the school menu, really? So are you saying that the food at Uninorte is unusual? Because I thought it was delicious. It is wonderful. Oh, public schools. Okay. So that makes sense. So basically your public schools have a similar problem to our public schools with them not being very nutritious. Okay. That's interesting. Okay. So I think that we'll just keep going a little bit and take a break in a few minutes instead, since it has only been about 40 minutes. Oh, sometimes kids don't get any meals. That is worse. So the way that school meals work here is that families who earn a certain income, they can fill out paperwork at the beginning of each school year. And on that paperwork, they write down what their income is and all of that kind of thing. And then the students are eligible for free or reduced cost lunches. And so they would be able to get the same exact meal that anyone else in the school gets. They're just not paying for it. So they're not getting a special meal. They're just getting what everybody else is getting. And right now during COVID, actually, they have opened up free meals to every student. So it used to just be for kids who are lower income. And right now, every student is getting free breakfast and lunch at school. Typically, the federal government has provided for all students to get free breakfast. And then some students who qualify also get free lunch. So that's one way, but the food is not nutritious at all. This is interesting. I'm just reading the chat. Public schools. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, we've really tried to give kids, meals if they're hungry, but, the problem is that nutrition piece, and we have a lot of problems right now with obesity and childhood diabetes. And it's absolutely because they're not getting good nutrition at school. It is a public health problem. It's really getting bad. And we're losing a lot of physical education time in school and recess. So the children are not getting exercise either. Elsa, I think somebody's asking for you to translate a little bit.
Sí, para todos los que están en el chat, no se preocupen, pueden escribir en español y yo voy traduciendo al inglés, no se preocupen.
Learning coach. Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm not familiar with that program, but that is great that they're focusing on experience. that sounds like we have some specialty programs, and this might be one of them, like Montessori or Waldorf. I think probably those exist in Colombia as well, because they are international programs that's more focused on experience. I've also shifted my teaching a little bit at the university level to try to focus more on experience than on grades. But it's a really difficult shift because students have really internalized that grades are the most important thing. And so by the time they get to the college level, it's like the only thing they care about is getting that grade. So I'm trying to help them shift that mentality a little bit, because it is really important for learning. Okay. All right. So one thing that I want us to talk about is equality of educational opportunity and the degree to which students have the opportunity to learn in schools, no matter who they are. So from the beginning, some students have been marginalized in public schools, especially Native American children, African Americans children, children who don't speak English, and students with disabilities. So we're going to talk about each of these 4 areas coming up. So one of the things that we have done in this country is, especially this, let's see, this started in about the late 1800s. We would take our Native American or indigenous children and take them from their families and move them into boarding schools. The goal of these schools was for the children to assimilate to American culture and lose their Native American culture. As the settlers were moving west, so, you know, we started out with the 13 colonies that were along the Atlantic coast. And as settlers were moving west, they were colonizing that, you know, the rest of the land. Of course, there were already people living there, but they felt they had, it was called manifest destiny. And they felt that it was their divine right granted them by God to take over and colonize that, all that land from, you know, the East Coast all the way over to the West Coast. And they felt that the native people there were uncivilized, and it was their duty to civilize them into the culture of the white man. So the children were removed from their homes and sent away to boarding schools. They were required to speak English. Many of them, most of them, really lost their native tongue. Their hair was cut, and they were expected to assume the values of Anglo culture. This is another video that actually, wait, that's the wrong video. Let me get the link real quick to this other video that I want you to watch. Let me just do this. Sorry if you are seeing yourselves twice. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. I put the wrong link. Okay, so I will put this link in the chat. This is another about 10-minute video.
Bueno, vamos a compartir el otro video para conocer pues el tema de la cultura de los indígenas en Estados Unidos y la relación con la educación, qué pasa, cuál es la posición del gobierno en esos momentos del siglo XIX con respecto a los nativos, y la idea es mirar este video. También un poco ver este video con los ojos de Colombia. Fíjense que nosotros también tenemos mucha diversidad cultural, y la pregunta es, ¿qué estamos haciendo nosotros como país para abordar esta diversidad? Vamos a analizar desde lo histórico en este momento. Ya Katy nos acaba de compartir el link, y la idea es que lo puedan revisar. En este momento, cualquier pregunta, cualquier comentario, lo puedan hacer en el chat. Recuerden que lo pueden escribir en español sin ningún problema.
Okay, I put it in the chat. Can you see it?
Yes. So, Katy, could you also present the video in your
Sure. Yeah, I
screen?
think, yeah, let me see. Okay, give me 1 second. Can you see the video?
Yes.
Okay.
I did 2 boarding schools, one in Wapton Indian School in Wapton, North Dakota.
But I think that I can listen. Could you please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mid-60s.
Is that better?
Early 70s.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Where I wasn't allowed to talk my native tongue or practice my native ways. Numerous times I put on this big old white, big huge white comb, put on there, it says dunce. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know English. They put it on me, make me wear it all over. Kids would laugh at me. They took me away from all of that and punished me for talking that. It was my first language. I didn't know any other language. But whenever I talk, it came out. Cree would come out. And whenever I talk, I get hit. I got hit so much I lost my tongue. I lost my native tongue. The only thing I remember was my Indian name. Which is Xenil means old man eagle. That's the only Cree I knew. They beat me. Every day, they beat me. They cut off my hair, made me kneel in front of the door where everybody come in. Everybody make fun of me when they come by me, rub my head and laugh at me because I was talking. They caught me talking. I hope someday somebody will hear me. I hope nobody has to go through this. We have to have our own language. Because what we do when we talk to our spirits, they don't understand English. They look at you, you'll be talking English. What are you saying? Tanto hein? Tanto magreto hein? Probably saying that. Cree. But no, you didn't know what I just said. That was a hard time in my life. I'll always remember it. For that white man, it's a terrible shame for him to be treating people like this. Because we are the people. We just need to be accepted.
So that was an example of someone who had been to the boarding schools as a child. And you could see that going to the school caused him permanent mental anguish. Basically, once he was asked to cut his hair and lose his language, he was often placed in the corner with what we used to call dunce caps. For students who weren't behaving, it was an old discipline technique. And if he didn't speak English, he would be placed in the corner and have to wear the dunce cap on his head. These schools were in effect in the United States until 1973. So that is within, many of our lifetimes, a little bit before. Maybe, I'm not sure how old all of you are, but your parents' lifetime for sure, 1973. Many of those people who were sent to them are still alive. I read an article recently about a child who is now grown, and he recently, at age maybe 60, went back to school and earned his high school diploma after leaving those schools from all of that stress then. I want to show you also some photos. Let's see if they will open. There we go. Oh, here we are. So one of the most famous schools was this Carlisle School. Let's see if I can make these bigger. No, I can't make it bigger. But you can see here that basically the children would come into the school wearing their traditional indigenous clothing, and then they would be expected to cut their hair. All their hair would be cut. They would be dressed in traditional, like English style clothing, like in this picture here. That's a picture of the boarding school itself. Here is a photo of the physical education classes. And you can see they're all wearing uniforms. They all have the short hair. They were often dressed in military style clothing as well. Here are the girls wearing the traditional high-necked long sleeve dresses that were popular at that time. And here's a picture of how the children would have come to the school taken from their families. Many times they were, they caught diseases while they were at school and illnesses. There are burial grounds on the properties of many of these schools where when children died, if they got measles or there were a lot of eye diseases that were like highly contagious and they were left untreated. So the children developed severe infections and many times they were just buried on the property. Parents weren't always notified. It was a pretty difficult situation. Here's a picture you can see of them, you know, in after they've had their hair cut and everything. They were teaching them skills that they were supposed to be able to use to get jobs. So many of the classes that they had the students take were for trade, and they would teach them how to be farmers or things like that. But then they would be learning skills that were outdated. So they would teach them how to use certain equipment, but then when they went to get a job, they would find that people weren't using that equipment anymore. And so they wouldn't be able to do the thing that they had been trained to do. So it was really just ruining these people without giving them any sort of usable trade or skill. Now, some families did resist and protest. There would be families who would go en masse in big groups to go and pick up their children and take them home. There would be families who would refuse to send them. And sometimes, you know, they got away with it, and other times the families were also punished. Okay, so this is one of the darkest, I think one of the darkest hours in our nation's educational history. Okay, now these schools do still exist today, but they look completely different. Now, instead of the United States government running them, the indigenous tribes themselves run them. So instead of teaching English culture and English language and English customs, the families and the schools are trying to reteach the native culture and native language. So families are choosing to send their children to boarding schools so that they can regain their native traditions. So it's a completely different experience now, and the families are sending their children there by choice. So do Colombian schools, how do Colombian schools work with indigenous populations?
Hi, Miss Kathy.
Yes.
I'm Bridget Morris. I didn't have experience with Indian people in Colombia, but it is something that was in my mind when I was watching the video, and it was, as you said, a hard situation for the school at the United States. But I think that this is something that is still happening, not just in the States, but also around the world, because when we used to stop cultures or new things when we don't know what is happening in other cultures. So I think that and I think that I can say that because my project is about cultural responsibility, and I'm focused on what about culture is and all the issues that culture have inside, okay? But it is difficult to know that with all the history that we have, that with all the models that we have around the world, and with all the new pedagogies and methodologies that we have, it's difficult to notice that I'm a new teacher, I'm a young teacher, and I don't have the experience with Indian people. And it is difficult because we don't know the culture, and as we don't know the culture, we just say like a border between our culture and their culture, even if we are in the same country. And it is difficult. And the last thing that I just want to say is that in Netflix, there is a program that is called N with E, I think, N with E.
Okay.
And I think that if you go to season 2 or 3, there is a part about this school that you show us, that you already showed us, with Indian people and all the difficult situation with the families and with the hair, and they were uh, used to do things that they don't like to do, and also with the religion and all that is in the history and that is in the past is still happening in the present. So it's a big responsibility that we have as a teachers to engage people in the same model of education. I think that this is our big responsibility.
I'm so glad that you talked about that, because it made me think that, you know, our teachers here are predominantly middle class, so middle social economic status, and mostly white and mostly women. But most of the children who they are teaching are mostly children of color, and not necessarily in the same income area. So the problem that we're having today is making sure that our teachers are prepared and feel capable of teaching children who are very different from them. We might not have a high population of Indigenous children in our schools, but we do have children of color. And like you said about hair and everything, still, we had just in the news last week a teacher who cut a child's hair because they didn't think it was appropriate for school.
Oh my God.
Right. And so even though some of this is in the past, like you said, it's still very much happening today. It just might look a little bit different, but no teacher should be doing that, right? You know, they should know better. So that's one of the things I'm glad you brought up, because some of it is in the past, but much of it we're still trying to cope with today. So, you know, in the chat, is that Elsa said about Indigenous communities promoting their own curriculum. I think that that's happening a little bit here. We have reservations, which also is sort of a bad part of our history. When all of this was happening with the boarding schools, also at the same time, we had something called the Trail of Tears. I don't know if that's something that you all know about, but there was a movement where Indian populations were relocated from where they had been. So the idea was to kind of make things very uncomfortable for them. So let's say you had a tribe that was based in like the middle of the country in maybe South Dakota. They might have been forced to relocate someplace else. So they would be now in a place that had different weather, different terrain, different landforms, and then they would be forced to live there. So they would be put on a reservation. So those reservations, those land areas still exist today. And on those reservations, the government there is an Indian government, a tribal government, and they can do whatever they want on that space. So in those areas, they would be able to have their own curriculum, but it's not something that would be a statewide or even a national thing. It would just be within those reservation schools. Okay, so the other areas that we're going to talk about now are two laws or two policies that came into effect that affected other populations. So we've just talked a little bit about the Indigenous people, but I also want to talk about Brown versus Board of Education, which was a court case, and another education policy called IDEA. So Brown versus Board of Education was a court case that had several families on the case. Alphabetically, the first family was Brown, so we call it Brown versus Board of Education. And they sued the state of Kansas because they wanted to send their daughter to the closest school in the neighborhood. Linda Brown was an African-American girl who was, I think, 6 years old. And she lived in a neighborhood. And in order for her to get to school, she had to attend the closest Black school. But the closest Black school was far away and her family had to drive her to it. On the way to the Black school, they passed several other schools that were closer to her house, but they were schools only for white children. So Linda Brown's dad and a bunch of other families sued the city of Topeka, Kansas, and said that you are not providing my daughter equal educational opportunity because you're making her go to a school all the way across town. We want her to be able to go to this school that's right up the street. So after a long process, the Supreme Court in the country ruled that all schools across the country had to be desegregated. So there could no longer be Black schools and white schools. They had to allow Black children to go to the white schools. What was interesting about this case is that they didn't say that white children should integrate into Black schools. They really only thought that Black students should integrate into the white schools. So it wasn't really equal, even though they were trying to desegregate. And what's interesting now is that that case was in 1954. Schools today in 2020-21 are actually more segregated than they were in 1954 because the neighborhoods where people are living are more segregated pretty much across the country. Many of the schools where my students go for their internships, they are predominantly Black or predominantly white. And we have some schools with our population shifting that are becoming primarily Latino, which is a very big shift because even 10 years ago, we didn't have very many Spanish-speaking students. And now there are some schools that are 80% Hispanic. So our population demographic is shifting, but that policy basically said, you can't deny a child the ability to go to school based on their I don't know why it started echoing. Okay, the other one, okay, so the other ones are the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which we call IDEA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is ADA. Now, ADA, I think, is really interesting because when I came to Colombia, I noticed that you have a lot of sidewalks in some of the neighborhoods that are cracked and broken, and you don't have as many ramps, like sidewalk ramps, as what I'm used to seeing here. And that's because we have this law called ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, that requires that public spaces be accessible to all people, even if they have a disability. So many of our intersections in big cities have on their ramp to get into the street from the sidewalk, it's got bumps on it so that people who are blind, if they have a cane, their cane would identify the bumps. Or there are ramps to get into many or all of our federal and state buildings. So anything that is a courthouse or a federal building, all of it has to have ramps and elevators. And even the buttons inside the elevators have to have Braille so that they're accessible to people with disabilities. The way that that's visible in our education system is through this policy called IDEA. And IDEA is an act that provides federal funding to any and all schools to guarantee that children who need special education services get them. So all of our public schools are supposed to be providing access to education for students with disabilities. This could be a physical disability, it could be an emotional disability, it can be an intellectual disability. So all students, no matter what they come into school with, are required or have to have the ability to attend a public school in the United States. if a school can't provide for that disability, then it's the school district's responsibility to find another place for that student to go. So let's say there's a student who has autism and is really far over on the spectrum, and so they can't really function in a regular classroom setting. It's the school's responsibility to make sure that there is somewhere within the district for them to go. So there might be another school that that child attends with other students who have a similar disability, but they make sure that they have as much access to education as possible. And that's for children ages 3 to 21. So we do early access if you have a child with a disability, and we also guarantee public education all the way through they are until they're 21 years old. So while most of our students graduate at 18, if you have a disability, you can stay in public school until at least 21 years old. Any comments on what that's like in Colombia? How do you all think access, are buildings accessible, or are schools accessible to children with disabilities? Okay, so there's an inclusion policy. Okay, oh, but let's see. I should have said also, if I'm speaking too quickly, please tell me and I will slow down. That's true here too. So teachers are supposed to know about how to handle all of the different types of disabilities. Our students in their teacher preparation classes take one course in special education. We also have other teachers who are specialized in special education. So their degree is in special education, where everybody else is just like a general education degree. Okay, so now we are going to, oh yeah, same here. Not all the schools have the appropriate spaces and materials. It is definitely a challenge. Let's go ahead and take a break now, stretch our legs and everything. Let's come back. It's 5:48, so let's come back at 6 o'clock.
Bueno, tenemos un descansito de 10 minutos. Podemos conversar a las personas que están presentes si quieren tener algunos comentarios en español sobre la temática. Es muy interesante ver que unas veces pensamos que los Estados Unidos pues tiene todo resuelto. Eso es lo que unas veces nosotros nos imaginábamos, que tienen los recursos, que tienen la disponibilidad, que tienen los docentes, y pues ya se dan cuenta que pues no es así, que tienen los mismos retos de nosotros, claro, en diferente nivel, pero aún los tienen. Entonces, sobre todo, bueno, una cosa que sí tiene de ventaja es que en Estados Unidos, pues el acceso a la educación sí es para todos. Por ejemplo, yo tuve la oportunidad de estudiar en la Universidad de Nebraska, mi doctorado en desarrollo infantil, educación infantil, y pues la distribución, digamos, de los colegios es sobre todo se da por la cercanía al colegio. Entonces sí, hay colegios en los que se ve diferentes estratos socioeconómicos, porque todos están viviendo, digamos, en barrios comunes. Entonces, y en estos escenarios, por ejemplo, donde confluyen diferentes estratos socioeconómicos, la educación es igualitaria y le dan todo el plan de alimentación a los niños, independientemente tengan unos recursos. Entonces, lo que sí es una queja, y es una queja del sistema educativo de los Estados Unidos, es el tipo de comida que se da. Parte, digamos, de mis prácticas de investigación fue estar en los jardines infantiles del programa de primera infancia en los Estados Unidos, y a pesar de que se han tratado de hacer mejoras en la parte de alimentación, pues es cierto lo que decía Katy al inicio, de que hay mucha comida enlatada. Entonces, por ejemplo, de los menús que era común ver, sí, se veían las verduras, eso generalmente se le daba, o sea, se ve, por ejemplo, zanahoria, brócoli, etcétera, pero por ejemplo, el postre, de las cosas que yo siempre observaba, era que el postre siempre era enlatado, o sea, era, imagínense, unos melocotones enlatados, unas fresas enlatadas, y todos sabemos la cantidad de azúcar impresionante que tiene los... eh, los productos enlatados, y sobre todo cuando son las frutas. Entonces, esa es una limitación que tiene, pues es cuestión más que todo de mejorar los menús, pero digamos que por lo menos en términos de cobertura, hasta el momento, pues el término, lo que se habla de seguridad alimentaria está cubierto. Ahora lo que hay que mejorar es la calidad. Y eso unas veces, eso sí definitivamente es un gran avance. Nosotros sabemos que en nuestras escuelas no es así. No sé, quisiera saber en el chat bueno, a quienes tenemos aquí, quienes están en el espacio, si están todos de la misma ciudad, bueno, de Barranquilla, o tenemos diferentes ciudades o diferentes incluso países. Pues cuéntenos. Quienes están por aquí, si se quiere presentar, se pueden presentar, y pues los micrófonos están abiertos en este break, y también puedo utilizar libremente el chat que tienen. Marta Orozco nos levanta la mano. Claro que sí, Marta, adelante.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Elsa Lucía, ¿me escuchas?
Sí.
Bueno, perfecto. Bueno, me presento. Muchas gracias. Marta Patricia Orozco, colombiana. Vivo en Cartagena. Pedagoga con una especialización en lúdica educativa. Y bueno, muy interesante el curso. Y bueno, dándole un saludo desde la distancia a todos que están aquí en este curso de aprendizaje, y a la vez a la profesora Katy, que se encuentra en Estados Unidos. Quería hacerle una preguntita, aunque para nadie es un secreto que Estados Unidos es un país subdesarrollado, y es desarrollado, perdón, y es una de las potencias, hablándolo así. Pero sabemos que hay diferentes culturas entre la niñez. ¿Sí? Lo que nombraba yo ahorita sobre las diferentes culturas que tienen. No vamos muy lejos, porque aquí en Colombia, y mi pregunta era la que le hacía en estos momentos en el chat, que si allá en Estados Unidos hay discriminación en colegios públicos o colegios privados, ¿sí? O está también la desigualdad. Porque hablamos en nuestra constitución política aquí de Colombia que sobre la educación es gratuita en Estados Unidos. O sea, ¿cómo hacemos nosotros que si allá en Estados Unidos nuestros niños, niñas y adolescentes no son discriminados, o también hay bastante maltrato infantil, maltrato físico, psicológico, porque muchas veces nos damos de cuenta que nuestros dirigentes a veces le aplican mucho a otras cosas y no a una educación, que los niños son el futuro y son las nuevas voces, ¿sí? Entonces es aplicarle o darle a un niño un lápiz, un cuaderno, ¿sí? Y que ellos lo necesitan. Entonces esa era mi pregunta, Elsa Lucía, para ti también, que hablas el inglés y que lo hablas muy bonito, por cierto. Y bueno, Esa era mi pregunta. Muchas gracias.
O sea, Marta, que tú quieres saber es que si en los colegios básicamente se dan los procesos de discriminación, o sea, si se dan la discriminación, ya sea en los privados o en los públicos, ¿cierto?
Exactamente.
Ok, no, Marta, un placer conocerte y qué rico que participes en este escenario. So Kathy, Marta, she was talking a little bit about the Colombian context and thinking about the North American context. So, U.S. is a developed country. I mean, so from our perspective, so you guys have a lot of opportunities that we don't have here. And so it's very good to have access to education. However, her concern, Marta's concern, it's about discrimination. So, so her question is if you consider that children are discriminated in public schools and private schools. Because here in Colombia, there are discrimination because of socioeconomical conditions or race, but for example, here maybe we are a little bit more homogeneous. However, our big problem here is the differences in terms of socioeconomical conditions. So what about in your case? So she would like to know more about the discrimination, and also is she's worried about the child maltreatment. So she would like to know if this is a problem also in the schools.
See, yes, it's the same, unfortunately. I think that many people in our government would tell you that there is no discrimination happening and that schools are equal. However, if you actually go into the schools, you'll see that there is a wide difference between schools that have a lot of money and schools that don't have a lot of money. Due to policy that was in place, Jim Crow laws, we called them here. It was a string of laws that were allowed legal discrimination. So because of those laws, all through the 1970s and even some today, there was a history of legal discrimination that has modern implications. So because of policies in the 1930s and 40s that prevented Black families from living in certain neighborhoods, those same neighborhoods today are very poor and the schools are not very good. Also things like generational wealth, which probably you see in Colombia also, where some families have had access to money for generations, but our families of color here, especially Black families, never were able to build that generational wealth. So I think you would find a lot of the same segregation based on socioeconomic status here that you see there. Here, people are, they pretend that it doesn't exist, but it exists.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So, pues ella nos comenta que aparentemente el gobierno dice que todos los colegios son iguales, que todos tienen las mismas oportunidades, pero al final del camino, cuando uno vaya directamente al colegio, lo que se observa es que hay desigualdad. Entonces, hay colegios que se ven con más recursos que otros. Entonces, por ejemplo, en barrios que son, digamos, donde vive población con limitados recursos, también se observa que los colegios que están ubicados allí no son los mejores y que también cuentan con limitaciones en los recursos. O sea, que al final del camino incluso se nota la diferencia presupuestal entre los colegios. La otra cosa que se hablaba es que en términos de desigualdad socioeconómica, por ejemplo, se notan las diferencias raciales. Por ejemplo, muchas de las familias que son afroamericanas se caracterizan porque no han lo que se llama riqueza generacional, o sea que no acumulan la cantidad de riqueza que lo que podría alcanzar una familia caucásica. ¿Por qué? Porque las familias caucásicas tradicionalmente históricamente han cultivado esa riqueza años tras años y por tanto va pasando y es hereditaria, cosa que no sucede en las familias, muchas familias afroamericanas. Entonces, eso genera una desigualdad ya de base porque por más que se trabaje no van a alcanzar lo que correspondería a estas riquezas generacionales. Entonces, eso era uno de los puntos pues, que nos comparte Katy. Es interesante porque nosotros también pensamos que ya todas las condiciones son iguales, porque igual es el discurso que uno escucha, pero evidentemente no es la realidad y también como nosotros vivimos, digamos, en Colombia las desigualdades, ya lo estamos viendo en este momento en el paro nacional, las desigualdades que hay, las de oportunidades y las falencias del sistema educativo que Estados Unidos también lo vive. Había levantado la mano Brigitte. Brigitte, adelante. So Brigitte has one question.
No, it was not a question, it was just a comment, but I think that
okay.
you already told it. It was about the policies here in Colombia, because all we know that we have the policies, but I think that what is really missing is the opportunity or maybe the resources, because when Dr. Katie was talking about, Kathy was talking about the special education, here in Colombia we have programs for the special education. I studied at Universidad del Atlántico, and my degree was in foreign language, but there is a degree in special education, but not all the programs about education have the same curriculum like a special education all the semesters or a semester during the career. So I think that it is difficult when we have the policies, but in my case, I didn't receive a special education. And everything that I know is because I'm working since I was studying at the university. Mm-hmm. So I had the opportunity to work in a not public school, and they are like a brand. Mm-hmm. They said that it's a good school for everybody that is in need, something like this. And it's so crazy because when I was working with them, I didn't have idea about what it has to do with children with special needs, and I was so scared to do something bad, because it is hard for us as teachers that we have to do our work, but also to do something like perfect, because this is what is the school brand, but it is in a not public school. So we had forums like special education, and we had conversation, and we were used to talk about those kind of situations with people with I don't know the name in English, with autism, but I don't remember the name, Elsa. Could you please help me?
Autism?
Autism.
Autism, yes.
Yes, autism.
Yes, with some special needs like this, and we try to do our best, or I try to do my best. But in public school, even when we have the policies, we don't come with the resources to teach like we were a special educations, a special educators. I mean, so I think that even the policies are there, we don't have the resources to teach like we have to do it. And this is just to talk about the special education, but we have also a physical special needs,
Mhm.
or a special physical needs, I think. So it's the same. This is just an example that what is our problem, and I think that it is not just in Colombia. I think that it happened in all the American countries.
Yes, it's definitely happening here. I know that, our students leave having taken one class. So if they didn't, obviously one class can't teach you everything there is to know about special education students. So most of what they learn from working and from experience, but they don't come in as prepared as maybe they should be to be able to handle those situations and children who are, severely disabled. I think they're probably more comfortable handling minor issues or minor challenges, but any child who maybe doesn't have a diagnosis and they're trying to get them special education services, they struggle. It's very hard. And, it's a challenge because we want them to be prepared, but it's hard to balance preparation with all of the other things that they have to be prepared to do. But I think it is the same. And I think we have come a long way, because 100 years ago, even 60 years ago, 70 years ago, children with special needs weren't even put into regular schools to begin with. So up until, more recently, probably even 1970s, when the IDEA was first passed, before 1972, children who had disabilities weren't even put in a regular school to learn anyway. So if we think about it in terms of the timeline, it has been 40 years, which isn't very long, but we've come a long way in 40 years. So I'm hopeful that in another 40 years, we'll be better prepared and we'll be doing a better job to make sure that kids are getting, the education that they deserve in the public school classroom. That's my hope, that in a little bit more time, we'll be doing better. But I think it is absolutely still a challenge. Does anyone else have a question or a comment?
No.
Okay, we will talk.
Oh, there is one question.
Sure.
How parent acts if they have child with autism? So what is their behavior if they get concerned, if they have, if there is a type of stereotype or something? I mean, so for example, in Colombia, if you have a child with autism or other special need, usually is pretty difficult, because it's not easy. I mean, the country is not doesn't have like the infrastructure and spaces and possibilities to develop the autonomy for these populations. So for example, I live in the US, and there it was pretty easy for people who didn't have, who has special needs to be totally independent, and even they could work, but in Colombia it's not the same. So that's why, so Sandy is raising her hands. Go ahead, Sandy.
Hi everyone. I lost the word,
Hi.
but question about with, for the example, with a boy with autism, and it's because the next thing, I'm a student. I have 22. I'm doing my university practice at Universidad Popular del Cesar, and I have a case with a student with autism. At the first time, I was scared because it was my first time, like having a classroom in front of me and managing kids and all of this. And when they told me you have a kid with autism, I was like, what am I going to do now? And for example, for a part of the school, I didn't receive anything for me to study or something like that. I had to do it for my own, and that was bad. But the thing, it was because the parents were like shy about this condition of their kid, and they were like, "This is my kid. He doesn't have a big autism or something like that. It's minimal, but that's it. I don't want to talk about that anymore. So go ahead." And that feels like when I knew that information. And I just wanted to know if in the USA, are the parents like the same? Like, I have a kid with autism. Are they shy or what? I just have that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think some parents are very shy like that. And some parents, they don't want their child to receive special education services. So the way that it works is that you, if you have a child who is having difficulty or needs to have special education services, the parent or the teacher can put in a referral for that child to get tested. And then they'll come back with the diagnosis and they'll give the student services and they'll give them a label. So they might say, oh, your child has autism, or your child has dyslexia, or your child has another disability. And then the child receives services for that disability. So there are some parents who say, no, I don't want my child to get tested at all. There are some parents who say, no, I don't want my child to receive special education services. And then there are parents who already come in and they tell you, my child has autism. These are the things that you need to do for my child to be successful. Please call me anytime you want. So we have all different kinds of parents here also, the ones who are very involved and the ones who don't want anything to do with it at all. I try to tell my students that parents have many reasons for not wanting to get involved in that process. Some parents don't want their children to have a label because they're afraid that their child will be discriminated against somehow in the schools, or they will be limited because they have that label. So that's one reason. Other parents are in denial and they don't want to admit that their child has a disability. And then some parents want to get as much help as possible for their child, and they are very prepared to help at home too. So I think it's the same here. We have a very wide range of parent involvement in special education.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments. It has been very interesting, the conversation.
Definitely.
And
so we will talk a little bit now about the way that schools operate today, since we talked about sort of what brought us to today. So schools today, we have a few options. I know that there's a lot of text on this slide, but really we have 5 different types of schools here in the United States. The first one is homeschool, and this is where parents decide to educate and teach their children at home. So when they do that, they can teach them whatever curriculum they want. They have to get approved every year. So they have to submit the work that their child has done so that the government can see that they're making progress, but the parents are in charge of everything. So that's one option. We have private schools, and some of them are religious, some of them are not religious. They can choose the curriculum that they want to use, and they don't take the tests. So a lot of families who don't want their students to take the tests will pay for their children to go to private school. Then we have public schools. We have three different kinds of public schools. We have traditional public schools, which is where I always worked, and that's where my students usually go to work. We have magnet schools. Magnet schools are public schools, but they have a theme. So you might go to a school for the arts, or you might go to a school for science and technology, or you might go to a school for like medical at a very young age. So not like becoming a nurse, but you might finish and get like a nursing assistant certificate. And then we have something called charter schools. And charter schools are new since about 2000, so about 20 years. And these schools follow their own curriculum, and they have to take tests. So, and they receive public money. And that's what makes it very political in the United States, because people say it's a public school, but they're following their own curriculum. They shouldn't be getting public money. And other people say we have to give families lots of choices. It's fine. So there's a debate about charter schools nationwide, but those are generally the types of schools that people go to. Most students are still going to the regular public school. Every child in the United States in grades K through 12, so ages 5 to 18, is guaranteed a free public education, regardless of their ability or disability, regardless of their race, gender, legal status. So if you are a refugee or an undocumented immigrant, you still have access to public schools in the US. It's not a perfect system. We have lots of problems. Some of them we've already talked about, but I think we can, say that it's a great thing that all of our children have access to public schools. So most schools are structured very similar to how they're structured in Colombia. We have early childhood preschool, and then we go to elementary school, and then we go to middle school, and then we have high school. So it's, preschool, and then K through 5, 6, 7, 8 grades, and then 9 through 12 is in the high school. So these are the ages I put up here. For preschool, we have something in Florida that's called Voluntary Pre-Kindergarten that provides free access to pre-kindergarten for all 4-year-olds. And that's what I was telling you before about how our new president wants that to be nationwide, but many people are arguing about it. We'll see what happens. Okay, we're gonna skip these because I wanted to talk about our, the things that we do for our students who either have language differences or have disabilities. So we'll just talk a little bit more about those. All right, so in the US, we don't have a national language, although many people believe that it's English. Really, it's just the majority of our population speaks English as their first language. That's really changing a whole lot due to immigration patterns. We have a lot of people coming from Spanish-speaking countries now, and that's really changing our school demographics. So I just wanted to show you this map. I think it's really neat to see how people are coming to the US over time, where they're coming from. So you can see each little dot coming from a different country. And over here in the corner, it tells you where most of the people are coming from. So you can see here, it's predominantly Eastern Europe. And then in the late 1850s, it shifts a little bit, and we're getting people starting to come from Asia. And you could see, you know, Spanish speaking countries, South America, Central America also coming. What's interesting throughout all of this time is as you're seeing the different trends in where people are coming from, we had a lot of immigration policies at different times in our history that have prevented people from certain countries from coming here or have allowed a lot of people from other countries from coming here. So there was a period of time where we didn't allow anybody. Let me actually pause this. We didn't allow anybody coming from China to come into the United States. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And basically we felt that the country had allowed too many people from China to come in and we had to stop it. And, you know, there were other times, especially during World War II, where we didn't allow people from Japan to come in. More recently, that has been preventing people from the Middle East from coming in. You know, we're not taking for a period of time, we weren't taking in very many refugees. We turn a lot of people away at our borders. So you can see here, 2010 to 2013, we had a very, very open immigration policy at that time. So people were really coming in from everywhere. Now, the challenge in our schools, of course, is that we have people coming here who speak many, 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 many different languages. Some of our schools have predominantly Spanish speakers. Like here in Florida, our next largest population is Spanish speaking. So a lot of our schools have English language programs that are a little bit more designed for people coming in who are Spanish speakers. Otherwise, we have students who, you know, some schools have students speaking 10, 12, 20 different languages. So then it becomes a challenge for us to be able to appropriately teach them English and also the content area so that they're not losing their education in the different subjects. Okay. So as far as implications, as I was saying, that basically means that we have a lot of different languages that we're trying to accommodate for in our classroom spaces. Okay. I think last time I talked to people in Colombia about immigration, I was told that most people immigrating to Colombia right now are coming from Venezuela. Is that still true?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, the biggest immigrant population now is from Venezuela. I mean, we don't have problem in terms of language because we have the same language, and also
Right.
even the dialect is not very, I mean, it's very close.
Okay.
But the big problem is maybe because we haven't had this situation before. So this situation emerged from the political situation of then. So we have created some strategies to provide, for example, education services, to even some of them receive the citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And also there are some governmental programs to support these families. However, it's not enough. And as you know, now we have a huge problem. I mean, social and and political problem. I would say that the country is having yeah, I mean, the country even cannot handle our own situation in terms of poverty, and at the same time we have to create these special programs for the Venezuelans, because now we are one family.
Right.
So we don't need to think about oh, that's an immigrant group, they are not from here anymore. I mean, we are one a big one group now, so we need to try to figure it out how to handle it. So and about your second question about how do schools provide support to non-Spanish speaking students, it's not
Right.
common.
Right.
And when we have non-Spanish speaking students, usually they are maybe because parents are maybe from the US, or and those parents usually they prefer private schools, because private schools offer a bilingual education. So the government, there is not like a special policy to cover this need.
Right. So we have special policies that are federal policies because so many of our students don't come in speaking English. One of the schools where my students are in their class, I think they said 85% of the students in their classroom have their first language as Spanish, and they are at varying degrees of speaking English. So if you are a teacher like me, I mean, I can speak some Spanish, but I'm definitely not fluent in Spanish. And if I was the teacher in that room and 85% of my students spoke Spanish as a first language, that presents a lot of challenges. I would be better off than some other teachers who don't speak any Spanish at all. So that's definitely a challenge that we are facing as our communities become more and more Spanish speaking. Our teachers are struggling more and more to be able to communicate with the families and the children. It also affects the ways that the children interact with their own families, because they're learning one language in school and they have another language at home. And sometimes the children refuse to speak their native language at home. And so they lose it. I had a student whose family spoke Russian, and the children could speak Russian, and then they decided that they were no longer going to speak Russian. So while their parents were bilingual, their grandparents were not. So these children at age 10 and 11 made the decision to stop being able to communicate with their grandparents. So it's not only a language issue, but it's sort of a cultural issue too. And because our country is still so Eurocentric, we here don't value second language, third language as much as it's valued elsewhere. Here people, they still look down on people who speak a different language as their first language. It's a really big problem here. Another thing that you said about being one family now, that's not really a mentality that we have as a culture here in the United States. Many of our communities are very like American centric. They are very individualist areas. And so people here don't always think of it as we are one big family now. It's very much us and them. And we speak English, you don't. We are American, you aren't. So I think that's another big problem in our country, is that we are not, we're not open and we're not welcoming to things outside of like the English experience in most of our school districts. There are some school districts that are, but generally speaking, we're not a collectivist country. We're a lot more individualist. And I think that has a lot of I think we have a lot of problems with that. I don't think that that's a positive attribute of our country. So this next slide kind of, I think it's, yeah, this one looks at different language ideologies and how language is taught across different schools here in the US. It sounds like a lot of at least the private schools in Colombia are more on this language as asset additive side of the spectrum. So basically what we're looking at here is on one side of it, we see second language as a deficit and something that we want to remove. So even if we look back to those Native American boarding schools, language, the home language was considered a deficit. Many schools are still trying to take away that home language and only add in English instruction. So they will teach everything in English and just expect the students to catch on and learn the best that they can. On that side of the spectrum, they want the students to assimilate to American culture and to the English language only. As you move over the spectrum to the other side, the second language or the home name language actually becomes more and more valuable. I shouldn't say second language because it's first language. So we have some English immersion schools where, you know, the kids are just put in the school and expected to learn English with no support. Federally, that's not allowed anymore. Federally, if students come in speaking another language, schools have to, by law, provide them with English language services. So that brings us to immersion with ESL support. ESL stands for English as a Second Language. So the kids are immersed in the English speaking classroom, but they're provided support to help them learn English throughout the school day. So depending on how much English they speak, they might be pulled out and work with a different teacher for 30 minutes a day. They might spend half their day with their ESL teacher who's helping them learn their content. Now, the ESL teacher doesn't always speak the student's language, so it's not perfect, but they are receiving some support. As you move over, they're getting a little bit more of the bilingual education. What we call transitional bilingual education means that the child is first taught both in their home language and in English until the child learns enough English, and then they're only taught in English. So it sort of is a transition between learning in their native language and then learning in English. As we move over, we have the dual language program and the two-way immersion program. And that's where students are learning throughout the day, both in their native language and in English. And English-speaking children are in the same classroom, learning part of the day in English and part of the day in another language. I've seen this, I've seen video, I've never really seen it in person, but basically they'll learn, like they might take a class that is grammar, and that might be in, like, let me back up. So you might have Spanish-speaking children, and they're in a class and they're learning Spanish language and grammar for part of the day. And then they might go into a science class, and that class might be in English. And the idea is that in those schools, they want students to be very comfortable with literacy in their home language also, because a lot of times what will happen is that the children will be speaking Spanish at home, but they won't necessarily be able to read it, and they won't necessarily be able to write it. So the goal of those dual language programs is for children to learn how to be literate in both languages at the same time. The idea is that the better you are at your native language, the more quickly you'll be able to learn a second language. Those kinds of programs are especially popular in areas where there is a very high population of children who speak that other language. There are also special magnet schools that are dual language magnet schools. So you would have that kind of teaching happening. And then, you know, as we're on that side of the spectrum, obviously you can tell that dual language, multilingual children are valued in schools like that. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, we're trying to do away with that home language altogether. So we have schools currently operating on both sides of this spectrum right now. But like I said, by law, schools are required to provide children with instruction that helps them learn English. And that's because of another court case back in the 1970s. Okay, in our teacher preparation programs, our students take between 2 and 3 classes that are designed to help them learn how to work with English language learners. So in the state of Florida, they're required to have an endorsement that shows that they have the skills to teach students who need language assistance. And we have this strategy checklist that I'm going to show you that all teachers in our school district have to have for every student who speaks a language other than English. So basically, I know that it's a little bit hard to read, but they have organized their teaching strategies into a couple of different topics. One of them is about like just cross-cultural communication and just basically showing that as a teacher, you understand that other cultures are important and valuable. So you might have biographies on your bookshelf that have people from a variety of different cultures. You might have a map in your classroom that, you know, has points labeled where different students' families are from, that kind of thing. We have instructional strategies where we allow children to use foreign language dictionaries or heritage language dictionaries, which basically allows them to look up a word and translate it into, you know, English or their home language. We might do things that are like pre-activities. So students who are learning English, we might give them the vocabulary words ahead of time so that they're familiar with the words before we get into the lesson. We might also give them the choice of, instead of writing their answers out, they might be able to say them, or they might be able to draw it and then label it. So some of those more basic language experiences. I remember, you know, being in Colombia for like my language immersion 2 weeks a couple years ago. There would be days where I would sit in class and I would be so overwhelmed by listening to Spanish all day and only being able to understand, you know, half of it, and just how like exhausting that is for a student, where you're trying as hard as you can, but it doesn't mean you're able to process or communicate. So having that kind of awareness as a teacher goes a long way with helping to make sure that a child feels comfortable in the room. So those are some of the other things on here, like allowing students to be quiet for a period of time and not expecting them to constantly be sharing. Other things on this list, labeling parts of the classroom in English, but then also in the student's native language. I'll go into some classrooms now and see labels in Spanish and French and Arabic and English, because there are children in the room speaking all of those different languages. We also have adapting or, you know, simplifying tests and quizzes just to make sure that students are being tested on the content that they need, rather than, you know, kind of double assessing them on English language and also the content. So there are a lot of things that our teachers are expected to be able to do to make sure that students speaking a variety of languages still have access to that education. Like I said before, that comes from a law or a court case that was Lau versus Nichols, and this was based in San Francisco, similar to Brown versus Board of Education, where a family felt that their child didn't have access to the same education because they were being taught in English but didn't know any English. So after that court case, federal law stated that we have to provide these kinds of accommodations to all students in our public schools. Okay, so really what we teach our students is that the #1 most important thing to help our English learners is for the teacher to just show that child care Basically what Elsa was saying about how we're a family, we try to encourage our teachers to have that attitude with the students in their class. And most of them do. You know, most of the students that I work with are very like nurturing and caring, but it goes a long way because, you know, even if you learn 5 words in your student's language, even if you try to talk to their parents or use Google Translate, those kinds of things make a really big difference in helping a child feel welcome. And if a child feels welcome and safe, then they feel safe to learn. So, you know, if we can do just a few small things to make sure that the child feels safe, they're much more likely to be able to learn and feel comfortable in our classrooms. And really, that's the most important thing that we try to instill in our students. Yes, we want you to learn all of these strategies, but even just showing simple care will go a long way to help you get things started with the students. Okay. Any other comments or questions about, you know, how we work with students who are English language learners? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about students with disabilities and just how we make accommodations in the classroom. Okay, so as I said before, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act guarantees the rights of students with disabilities to receive that free public education. Our policy first is inclusion, and I know that that's something that you all have discussed. That word is familiar to you. We also talk about something called the least restrictive environment. And what that means is that any student, we want them to have the least restrictions possible. So that means that we want them in a regular, typical classroom as much as possible. So let's say you have a student with a more mild disability. We want them to start off and spend as much time in the classroom with the regular teacher and, you know, a full class of students as possible. If that room is not enough for them and they need a little bit more assistance, then we're going to add another level of support. So we might take the special education teacher, or we might have a paraprofessional, so someone just working with special education students. We might have them come into the classroom for part of the day. If they're in the classroom for part of the day, that student is still in the regular setting for most of the time. They're just getting a little bit extra help. If that still isn't working, then what we might do is move that student into the special education classroom for part of the day. So maybe that child just needs extra help with reading. So we'll take that child and just during reading time, we'll bring them into the special education classroom and they'll get reading help, and then they'll come back into the regular classroom. If that's still not enough, we might bring that student into the special education classroom for math and reading. So they're with their special education teacher in a small setting for maybe half of the day. Then if that still doesn't work, they might be in the special education classroom for the whole day. So what you're seeing is that we're going from fewer restrictions where they're in the regular ed classroom with no support to maybe more restrictions where they're in the special ed classroom for the whole day. Then if that's still not enough, we might have the student move to a different kind of school or a different kind of class altogether. So if you have a student who has severe autism, they might need to be in a whole school that is an autism center. So they might have started out in a regular classroom, but then they need more and more and more and more support until they end up in the place where they're the most comfortable. So here we call that the least restrictive environment. We also have something called an individualized education plan. So every student who has a disability, who has gotten that referral and that label of whatever their disability is, they get this individual plan that is put together by the parent, the teacher, and then a couple of other people from the school. So usually the special education teacher is in that meeting. Sometimes the guidance counselor or school psychologist is in that meeting. And sometimes, depending on how old the child is, the child might also be in the meeting. So all these people get together and they make a plan for what supports that child needs in order to be successful. So it might have things on there like extra time on a test. It might have things on there like needs to sit by the teacher, has to have a break during the day. So whatever it is that the child needs gets written down on this plan, and then the teacher has to follow it for the year. And then usually they meet twice a year to see how the plan is working. The parent has to go to the meeting and the parent has to sign off on it. If the parent doesn't approve it or sign it, then the teacher can't do those accommodations. So this speaks to Sandy's question from before about how involved the parent is. If a parent refuses to participate, then the child can't receive those services. So we really try to make sure that the parents, if a child has special needs and needs those accommodations, we really try to make sure that the parent is involved. Otherwise, we can't help the child officially. So they meet usually at the beginning of the year and the end of the year to just go over the plan. Sometimes the meetings are in the fall and then in the spring, just to make sure everything is on track. If at any point the family or the teacher feels like there needs to be a change in the plan, they can call a special meeting and go over it again, or if something changes, they can go and make some adjustments. So here's an example of an individualized education plan. This is for a 6th grade student. You could see that at the top, they have written down what the student's strengths are and what the student's needs are. And then in the middle, they've put down specific goals that they have for that child to meet over that year. So you might have, this one has a writing goal where we want the student to write a multi-paragraph essay that includes a thesis statement and then some different, we don't want them to make these mistakes. And then on the side, we have the accommodations and modifications that we would do to help that child meet those goals. Usually an IEP has between 2 and 4 goals. We don't want to make it too much that a child can't achieve, but we also want to have enough goals that the child is making good progress. And then at the bottom, you'll see any sort of testing accommodations that might come in. So all school districts have their own individualized education plan. And actually, when I was looking for one to put in here, districts don't publish them online. It's very, very difficult to find what an official document looks like for an IEP. So they all include generally the same thing, but it might be formatted a little bit differently. But generally, they all include the goals that we want the child to achieve, and then the accommodations and modifications that the teacher is going to do to make sure that those goals happen. Then when they have the meeting at the end of the year, they look back at that original document and they talk about whether those goals were met. And if they were, they'll set new goals for the next year. And if they weren't, they'll talk about why and maybe what different modifications that child might need to be able to meet those goals. So the form itself might be different, but generally the content on the form is the same no matter what district you're in. They might just have some more specific information or testing results or things like that. So I think I have, yeah, that's the whole thing. I thought I had another page, but so how does that compare with what resources students are given and what, do you all have something that's like an individual education plan, or do you have, anything like that that sort of guides what resources and accommodations are given to students with disabilities?
Wow, this is a very good question, because right now everybody there is some governmental directions, guidelines about the they call universal designs for learning.
Mhm.
So the idea is that the schools can design and implement these universal designs. However, it's not, there are like some guidelines, but they are not official. So all the schools are free to, they can decide if they use it or not. So that's what we have done so far. That's the very new improvement, because in the past they talk about individualized programs, but that's pretty difficult to handle. So now we are trying to go for the universal design. So in this way, we can promote the inclusion policy. That's the new topic now in Colombia.
Yeah, so because this became law with IDEA, some school funding is tied to whether schools are doing this or not. So any school who has a student with a disability, they have to have a whole lot of documentation that shows that the school is meeting that child's educational need. If they don't, then the federal government withholds funding for the school. So they withhold part of the funding. So the funding that's designated for students with disabilities, the school won't get if they're not documenting how the school is meeting that child's needs. So the school has, every student who has a disability has an IEP. Every student who has a disability has to have 2 IEP meetings a year. All of that gets documented. If a student doesn't have 2 meetings a year, you have to prove that you tried to set up a meeting and explain why you weren't able to have a meeting. So at certain times of the year, schools get a little bit desperate, because if parents aren't responding or meetings get canceled, sometimes they'll have them by phone. Of course, now with COVID, everything looks a little bit different, because we never would have been allowed to have a Zoom meeting before, but now things like that, we have to, right? So we have to document all of that. The teacher has to keep records of how they're meeting or attempting to do all of the different accommodations and modifications. And then all of that gets submitted, or, somebody from the district, somebody from the state comes and does an audit. And so we get audited pretty regularly for things like this to make sure that we're following those procedures, so that the schools can get the federal funding. So all of this is very tightly organized because money is tied to it, which shouldn't be surprising. Anytime funding is tied to anything, there are a lot of records that have to be kept just to make sure that people are following through. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit, since most of you are in the education program, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how our teachers here are prepared to work in the classroom and how they're evaluated each year. So in order to teach in K-12 public schools here in the state of Florida, and actually all 50 of our states, teachers, I have a spelling mistake. Teachers have to be certified, and they have to hold a bachelor's degree. So the bachelor's degree can be in a variety of subject areas. We prefer that it's in elementary education. Some of our students, like the students that I teach in the Master of Arts in Teaching program, they have a bachelor's degree in something else, and now they're getting their master's degree in elementary teaching. So they might have their bachelor's degree in psychology or business or communications, and now they're getting their degree in elementary education, and they're learning how to teach and get their certification. So students have to pass 2 separate tests. One they take at the beginning of their program, and that is a general knowledge test, kind of like an ACT or SAT. And they have to show general knowledge of math, English language, reading, and writing. They have to write an essay. Then at the end of their program, they have to take another set of exams that show their ability to teach certain content areas. So it's like pedagogy for science, mathematics, social studies, and literacy. And then they also take a professionalism test that sort of demonstrates ethical behavior and classroom management and learning environment kinds of skills. So that's in addition to their coursework. They have to demonstrate competency on these exams. So these are, this is the program of study for my program. So this is a 4-semester program. They can take, like, some of their classes, they can take whenever they want, but most of them they have to take in order. You can see on here the TSL class at the top. That is about the language, like the English for students of other languages. They have 2 of those classes. The other one is down here at the very end of their program. You see in green towards the bottom, kind of EEX class, Trends and Issues in Special Education. So that's where they learn about special education. They also have a class called Role of Education in a Democracy. And the content of that class is actually very, very similar to the content of this lecture tonight, where they learn about the history of public education in the United States. And then they learn about the modern issues that are affecting teachers right now. And then they have other classes. You'll see like children's literature and literacy and science and mathematics that help them get prepared to teach those topics to children. They learn the pedagogy and the best ways to teach it. Okay, so then once they're in the classroom, teachers are evaluated annually. Usually their evaluation is done by their school principal. Sometimes it's by the assistant principal. And usually that happens once in the fall and once in the spring. Right now with COVID, it's really happening once just because there's so much else going on. And then as you gain more experience, you only have to have 1 a year instead of 2. Usually the way that looks is that the principal and the teacher will sit down and have a conference first and talk about what the lesson is going to be. And then the principal will observe the lesson, and then they'll have a conference afterwards where they go over how the teacher did and, you know, whether the objective was met and all of that. And then typically the principal will do a walkthrough a few times a year. I think it's like once a month, where the principal will just pass through the classroom and just take a quick observation about what's going on in the room at that time. We use the same evaluation process with our interns that our teachers use in Hillsborough County, where Tampa is, just because we want to be consistent. So when we go in and we evaluate our interns, we look at their instructional plan and whether they were able to write a good lesson that would lead to learning. We look at their learning environment and the way that they interact with the students and the way that they manage their class. And if there are a lot of behavior problems and disruptions, we look at their instruction, and then we look at their professionalism to make sure that they are being professional, being reflective, thinking about the work that they're doing. This is just an example of what our form looks like. So each of those areas that I just talked about is broken down into like sub areas, and then they're scored between requires action and exemplary. So most of our interns score somewhere between progressing and accomplished. Very few times do they get in that exemplary category because usually it takes time to build up to that skill level. Okay. So I wanted to also talk to you about our standardized testing, but before I do you have any questions about just how schools are set up, or, you know, how teachers become teachers, that kind of thing?
It would be because, you know, in Colombia, we don't need to have like credentials to be teachers. So here we just get graduated from a bachelor program in education, and then you can go and work. And even the Colombian, I mean, we have a law, and in this law, provide support to other areas and fields to work in education without a certificate or a bachelor degree. So, for example, an engineering could work in a school if they have the skills to teach math, for example. So there is a law that supports this idea.
Mhm.
So it's pretty difficult, and I mean, some teachers feel that it's not fair, of course, because I mean, it's the government now they have like a testing process for teachers so they can apply for these jobs. And so and this I mean, you can complete the application if you are a teacher or not, but if you pass the test, you can get the job in public schools. So that's a totally different system, because there you need the credentials. I mean, it's not enough that you already get the degree from the bachelor program. So that's one huge difference between the countries.
You know, we do have some programs like that. We call them alternative certification, but it's only for certain subject areas. So if you have your bachelor's in engineering, you couldn't get certified to teach elementary school, but you could get certified to teach secondary mathematics because the content is closer to what you would learn in calculus or algebra or trigonometry, right? It's not close to what you would teach in just basic mathematics. So if you have a bachelor's degree in a content area, you can take a test and just get your certification in certain subjects. But then other subjects like anthropology, you can't, because your classes aren't close enough to what that would be. So we do make allowances for that in certain subject areas, but not all of them. So if your bachelor's is like communications, you wouldn't be able to do that. But if it's biology, then you would be able to.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's I mean, it's like the same idea, but the process is different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's that's pretty interesting, because when we compare I mean, quality in when we are assessing quality, one of big component of quality is teacher professional development. So and it's not only related to the degree, it's also about all the process that they can do over the time, and that's another important topic here. So and I have a question for you. Do you have like any specific instruction or program that the teacher have to follow in terms of teacher development, or maybe the government establish a specific number of hours that they should take, maybe yearly, because so they can update their pedagogical competences?
So our certificates, once a teacher gets certified, they either get a temporary certificate or they get a permanent certificate. If they have a temporary certificate, they have to apply for a permanent one after 1 year or 2 years. You can only have a temporary for a little while. And it basically means that you haven't met all of the requirements yet. So they give you a little bit of time. Once you get your permanent certificate, it expires every 5 years. And within those 5 years, you have to take 150 hours of professional development and submit that with your money to be able to renew your certificate. So they have to be doing continuing education. Usually the school district provides opportunities for teachers to get professional development. So they might go to a training or a workshop. If they take a college class, I think they get 30 hours all at once. So there are lots of opportunities for them to get those points to be able to renew their certificate. So yes, that is something that's required.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, what I think another difference is that here, to teach early childhood, you don't need a bachelor's degree at all. And I think in Colombia, right, to teach early childhood, you do need a bachelor's degree. No?
No.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to be the head teacher, but if you are an assistant, you don't need that.
Okay.
But that's only for public schools.
Okay.
However, there are other options to be an early childhood educator. So, for example, we have like a 3-year. I mean, it's not a bachelor program. It's like a 3-year program. And there are some programs focused on early childhood, so that's another option that you can have. So you don't need the bachelor, you need the educate. I mean, you need to have some knowledge in early childhood, but you have other alternatives to train yourself in this area.
Okay, so here, in order to teach at a preschool, you only need a high school diploma. So, yeah, but again, if you were going to be the head teacher, you would need at least a bachelor's degree, probably even a master's degree. So I think, you know, it's different, but okay. So in the US, testing has sort of taken over, and it's especially bad in Florida. So I don't know how often your students take standardized tests, but here they start taking tests as early as pre-kindergarten. In Florida, they have to take a pre-assessment and a post-assessment at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. Part of that is because VPK, Voluntary Pre-Kindergarten, is free. And so the state wants to make sure that the people who provide VPK are doing a good job, because the state is giving them money. Again, you know, anytime anybody's getting money, there has to be documentation. So with the VPK programs, the schools give the children a pre-assessment at the beginning and at the end of the year, where they're supposed to demonstrate growth in things like, you know, do they know their shapes? Do they know their colors? Do they know their letters? Do they know the sounds of the letters? That kind of thing. Once they get into kindergarten, children are taking district tests. So like the county that I'm in has a test, and then also the schools have specific tests where they are testing the children in reading and math. They again measure growth, so they're taking them twice. They're taking it at the beginning of the year, and they're taking them at the end of the year to see how the children have grown. Once they get into grade 3, they take tests basically every year. Some of those tests we call high stakes. And the reason they're called high stakes is because if the children don't pass them, something bad happens. So in 3rd grade, they take a reading test. If they don't pass the reading test, they can't go on to 4th grade. In 10th grade, they have to pass their 10th grade tests sometime between 10th grade and when they would graduate after 12th grade. If they don't pass their tests, they aren't able to graduate high school, and they get a different diploma that's not a high school diploma. It shows that they didn't pass their tests. So that then limits their ability to get certain jobs that require a diploma, and it limits their ability to go on to college if they wanted to. So they also have, so every year between 3rd grade and 10th grade, they take a reading test and a math test. And then sometimes they take an additional test. In 4th grade, they also take a writing test. In 5th grade, they also take a science test. Also 8th grade. And then once they get into high school, they also take certain subject area tests like history or algebra or civics. And, you know, there's a variety of other tests that they take. So this is basically a table from grades K through 12 of all of the tests that the kids take. A D stands for the district test and an S stands for the state test. And then I put a little star next to the ones where students have to pass in order to get promoted to the next grade. So, you know, in addition to these tests, a lot of times the schools give another few tests on top of this. It is a lot to help prepare. They say they're preparing the students to take the other tests. So if you're in 3rd grade, you're going to have your reading test in May, but that's your state test. But then you're also going to take a district test at the beginning and at the end. And then your school is probably also giving you a couple of tests along the way to make sure that you're ready for that test in the end. Now, there's no evidence at all that all of these tests increase student learning or student achievement. In fact, I think we probably could argue that the opposite happens, right? Because if you're constantly testing, it means you're taking time away from instruction. So you have fewer opportunities to learn if you're always taking tests. Plus, it causes a lot of anxiety with our students. We're seeing kids get very, very stressed out before tests because they know that they mean a lot, you know, and so schools also get funding based on students' test scores. If students don't show growth from last year to this year, then schools might lose some of their funding. Teachers get merit raises also based on their students' test scores. So if students don't do well, it might affect the teacher's pay. So there's all kinds of reasons that these tests are very stressful, and they're stressful for everyone involved. And you could see why. I mean, they are getting an awful lot of testing. So that is, again, I think one of the weaknesses in our system right now is that we're so worried about competing and test scores that it's really getting in the way of learning other kinds of things. Also, if, you know, what you don't see up here really is history or civics or economics or things like that. Because those things don't get tested, many times those things aren't part of the curriculum. So what we were saying before about one of the differences between Colombia and the United States is that Colombia is more of a collectivist country where people see each other as a family. Our kids aren't really learning those skills because they're not learning social studies and they're not learning about, you know, the world. They're not learning geography. They're not learning things like that. So, you know, we have children who have never really been exposed to a map or a globe. And if they're not getting that all the way through their education because it isn't tested, that's limiting the education that they're really receiving. And it's kind of keeping them from being more well-rounded. So that's another unintended outcome, I think, of the high testing situation that we see. Okay, so in the US, right now, the hot topics are standardized testing. Public education is becoming more privatized. Like a lot of state governments, including Florida, are trying to take away public schools and build in more private schools. We are looking at education for immigrant students, especially all of our many language learners. Another hot topic is discipline in schools. There's something in the US called the school to prison pipeline. And what researchers have noticed, I would say over the past 30 years, is that our prisons have become privatized. And because our prisons are privatized, someone's making money off of the number of people who are in prison. Our prison population has gone up tremendously over the past 20 years. What we're seeing is that we also have school resource officers who are hired to work with schools. And so we have a lot of children of color, particularly Black boys and Black girls, who are disciplined at a higher rate, and then they are expelled and not allowed to go to public school anymore. and then they end up in trouble and getting arrested because they can't be in school, and then they end up in prison. So what we're seeing is that we have a high population of children who are getting kicked out of school and disciplined, and they are heading straight into prison. So here we're calling it the school to prison pipeline. So that's something that is, really big in educational research. I would say for the past 20 years, trying to figure out how we can adjust our discipline system so that we stop that from happening, especially because that's just really another way that children are being discriminated against, especially children of color. We also are having a big push towards anti-racist education, and that is basically what we were talking about before, with helping to make sure that our teachers are prepared to teach all different kinds of students, especially the students who don't look like them. So we are having a lot of teachers who are learning how to be anti-racist educators, learning about students of different cultures, learning about the ways that our school system discriminates, learning about things like the school to prison pipeline and the ways that our school structures are potentially harming students, including like the language issue and how some schools are really trying to prevent kids from using their native language and the ramifications that that has. So anti-racist education is a really big topic right now in our school circles. And I think that that really connects a lot to the department at your school. Elsa, who's in charge of that now that Francisco's gone?
The
peace education, the social justice. You know what I'm talking about?
No. So do you have, okay, explain me your context so I can figure it out what would be the case in our country.
The anti-racist education is aligned with social justice education and just like restorative, making sure that if a child gets in trouble, they aren't expelled or suspended. Instead, they might talk out what happened and work towards like a peaceful resolution of that process.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have that with those words. And in fact, so for example, maybe because of the context, it's the topic of, it's interesting because we are talking about inclusion, we're talking about diversity. We have a pretty diverse culture, but it's within the country. I mean, it's not like people who is immigrant is just I mean, we have African, Colombians and indigenous, and also the rest of the population, and we have many other, but there's not like, I mean, the big challenges, there are some initiatives. So for example, the African Colombian group, they are promoting a kind of anti-racist education, but it's pretty different because, for example, I used to work with in the US, promoting the cultural relevant pedagogy. So culturally relevant pedagogy. So from that perspective, the idea is to create an educational environment where everybody is free to express their opinion, and there is not based on the race differences. The idea is to create an environment where everybody is important, but inclusive Colombia, so for example, the African American Colombians, they try to promote their own culture, and the government approved a special class that is supposed to be mandatory, and the name of the class is African American class, something like that. But it's interesting because it's pretty focused on the culture. I agree, I like it, but that's not the way. Right. Because if we are promoting, I mean, an inclusive environment for children, it doesn't make sense if we create one class for the African American, the other class for the indigenous, the other class for poverty, the other class for, I mean, that it doesn't make sense. That's not a comprehensive view of the curriculum. So there is this huge debate because what is happening now is that the government tried to solve these situations, including these specific classes. So we also have, for example, we also have the peace class. Yeah. And the peace class is related to all this process related to the civil war. So it's related to violence, and so, but it doesn't make sense either. I mean, so at the end, if you are a student, you will receive thousands of classes. Each classes is very focused on one topic, but at the end, the situation is that I mean, we don't need to split the problems. We need to have a comprehensive ecological view of the problem, and that's what I see. That's what I see in our context. I mean, in fact, Brigitte, who is here, she is working on her master thesis. Is focused on culturally relevant pedagogy. So that's the idea, and she's working with African Colombian population, and the topic is focused on this situation. I mean, the purpose is to try to understand their practices and their views about the anti-racist education, but it's a kind of anti-racist education that is promoting racism.
Right. And that's exactly what we're trying to like work against here too. I think it's much newer, you know, because the culturally relevant pedagogy was like the language that we've been using up until this point. And now people are starting to use this language of anti-racist education because they're trying to do exactly what you're saying. Because if we are just looking at culturally relevant pedagogy, we're still keeping our same stance. We're just trying to bring in a lot of different cultures, but that stance is not working. We need to shift the way that we're doing everything so that we don't have to take a class on this and a class on this and a class on this. It's like the teacher's responsibility to shift the entire way they view teaching to be more inclusive, but you can't do that just by adding on more information. You have to like transform your entire self. And exactly, that's like the beginnings of that are happening here. There are some teacher preparation programs across the country who are doing that, but I think those are few and far between. More programs are like ours where we're starting to make that shift, but it's a difficult shift because politically we're facing a lot of challenges. Like our governor is opposed to, like he has said, no critical race theory, no, I don't want any classes on critical race theory. Well, critical race theory isn't bad. It's just helping you think about how race has impacted society. It's not bad in itself, it just gets you thinking. So when you have a governor who is saying any conversation about race is bad, as a teacher preparation program, you're kind of fighting against that if you want teachers to be anti-racist and, you know, shift their thinking to be more inclusive, like genuinely inclusive and not just surface level inclusive. So that's sort of where our program is heading right now, pushing culturally responsive pedagogy, hopefully pushing it even a little bit further than what we've been able to do so far. I don't know how successful we'll be, because the challenge is also that our program is all middle-class white women. So truly being able to understand issues of race is a little bit more challenging if you've never really been on the receiving end. So we have a lot of work to do to sort of push ourselves so that we can make our programs more anti-racist, more inclusive from like the foundation and not just surface level. So I think that's where our work is happening right now, to try to make sure that our students feel comfortable challenging what's been happening in schools this whole time. You know, I don't want any of my students to cut a child's hair. You know, I want to make sure that my students feel like they can speak up against that sort of thing. So, you know, that's kind of our goal, is to make sure that our students are actively working against those structures that have discriminated students and children historically.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge that all the country have. So especially now, I mean, there are many families who are moving from their country of origin. Now it's more common. We definitely need to create more curriculums where everybody feels that they are important, and there's not this discrimination at any point.
Right. One of the ways that we talk about it with our students is this idea of windows and mirrors. And we want children to see mirrors because we want them to see themselves reflected in their curriculum. But we also want to provide them with windows so that they can see other experiences that they've never had for themselves. So we want to make sure that our curriculum is very inclusive, so that it includes lots of different perspectives and experiences, so that some students see themselves and other students are learning about something they've never seen before or thought of before. So that's, you know, we're seeing a lot of that in like literacy classes with the books that we're asking students to read, but we're also bringing that into other content areas also, just to make sure that our students, our new teachers, are sort of taking that perspective so that when they become teachers themselves, they're able to provide windows and mirrors for their students also.
That sounds great. Like it. Makes sense.
Yeah. So that really brings me to the end of what I had prepared for us, but I wondered, you know, if anyone else has something that they would like to say, any comments?
Bueno, entonces hemos terminado esta sesión más histórica, más de los retos que tiene Estados Unidos ahora mismo. Si se dan cuenta, son prácticamente muy parecidos a los de nosotros, obviamente cada quien en su contexto, y pues nosotros pues tenemos otros escenarios también que enfrentar, pero lo que definitivamente no quedan dudas es que tenemos elementos en común. Bueno, abrimos los micrófonos si alguna persona presente tiene preguntas, tiene comentarios, lo puede hacer en inglés o en español. Y de esa manera pues cerramos estas primeras horas sobre este tema de educación, de básica primaria. Mañana pues las clases, ya para comentarles cómo funcionan, pues la clase pues ya se desarrolla conmigo, con otras profesoras. Estaremos trabajando el tema de educación infantil, medición de la calidad, la relación de la educación infantil y el desarrollo infantil, y ese será, digamos, la continuación de este espacio. Pues la idea hoy era mirar que cuando pensamos en educación infantil se piensa nada más en primera infancia, pero fíjense que segunda infancia, que vendría siendo educación, la básica primaria, pues también hay que tenerla en cuenta y tiene sus retos propios. Entonces la idea era que dentro de este curso de énfasis se le diera importancia también a la segunda infancia, y pues para eso tenemos a Katy explicándonos los diferentes contextos. Pues ya lo que hacemos en clase ya, pues bueno, en las clases que vienen, es que nosotros a partir de esto comenzamos a hacer estudios comparados con nuestro contexto, que al fin y al cabo es uno de los elementos importantes. De esa manera desarrollamos capacidad de pensamiento crítico, no solamente a nivel local, sino también desde una mirada global. Entonces, bueno, ¿alguna pregunta? ¿Algún comentario? Voy a mirar acá cómo van. Brigitte, ¿sí?
Hi, I'm sorry. I know that I was taking a lot of time in the meeting, but
No.
as Elsa said before, my project is about cultural responsible, and I really like the topic. So I would like to know, since your perspective, since your own experience or your personal opinion about what is the first step, what is the really very beginning for us as teachers to, yes, to start with this cultural responsiveness since our classrooms. That's my question.
Yeah.
What do you think that we have to do as a teachers since our classrooms, in our classes with our teachers, even though that now we are in a virtual context?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. And really, the number one thing I tell my students is that they need to get to know their students. And I mean, get to know everything, get to know their family, get to know their culture, get to know, and I don't mean like get to know stereotypes, but really ask questions of the family and get to know who they are. So instead of, like, at the beginning of the year, you might send home a survey that asks questions, but you want those questions to be meaningful questions. So you don't want to ask them, what's your favorite color? You want to ask them, is there a celebration that your family has every year? And why is that celebration special to your family? And really get them talking about who they are as a family and who they are as people. Because, just because like you might celebrate Christmas, right? But even if every child in your class celebrates Christmas, everyone is probably celebrating it in a slightly different way. And so really learning about those individual differences from student to student is going to help you then use that in your instruction. So it's like you want to take what you know about them, and then you want to plan your lessons and your interactions with the students to reflect who they are. So going beyond just knowing them, but then also what are you doing with that information that you have? Because you can know everything about them. If you don't do anything with it, it's useless, right? So that's like, for me, that's the very, very first thing. And then on top of that, I think you have to be open to learning about things that you don't know and not be afraid to say to your students, I don't know, can you tell me more about that? Or I don't know, let me get back to you tomorrow. Because what I think is worse than not knowing is telling them something that silences them or says something that is not true at all. And so I would say, like, really getting to know your students and not being afraid to ask them questions to help you understand them a little bit more.
Thank you.
Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. because I think that it makes me personal. So this is like a relationship between the teacher and the students, and I think that this is something precious that we have to to save like a treasure nowadays.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I love that. I love that, actually, the way that you said that it's a treasure.
Yeah.
Because it is, right? You know, they come to us and they trust us and they show us love, and it's our job to show them that same love and care and respect. It's so critical, and that's the way, you know, no matter who your child is in the class, showing them all that same degree of interest and care is so important.
Yes. Thank you, Miss Kathy. I really appreciate that meeting. I'm sorry because of my pronunciation, because today I have a treatment in my mouth, and I know that some words were not okay, but it is because I have a treatment in my mouth, and that's the reason why I don't open the camera. But I really appreciate your time, and I hope, Elsa, that we have most meetings like this, because this is really important for us to develop our thesis. Thank you, Katie. Nice to meet you.
You can send me an email anytime, and believe me, I appreciate that you are trying to speak English, because this would take so much longer if I was trying to understand Spanish.
Okay, thank you. I will do it.
Thank you very much, and Brigitte, for your comments. I mean, and your thoughts, and especially your motivation for your master thesis. I 100% sure that you gonna develop a very conduct a very nice study. Bueno, si alguna otra persona tiene alguna pregunta, pues nos comenta, lo puede dejar en el chat. De lo contrario, bueno, cerramos la sesión del día de hoy. Agradecemos a todos su presencia, su participación. Bueno, esto es más o menos el ambiente que se vive en la clase. Como les decía, hoy es más en la línea un poco más digamos, en formato de charla. Ya nosotros continuaremos con la parte práctica en términos de workshop en el resto de la clase. Qué rico que hayan estado aquí con nosotros, que hayan experimentado esto, que se den cuenta de, bueno, aquí están nuestros estudiantes participando, ustedes también, muchísimas gracias por sus aportes, y pues darse cuenta del mundo de Uninorte, de la Universidad del Norte, a través de la maestría en educación, modalidad investigativa, pues ofrece estos espacios, y se complace muchísimo de tener invitados como ustedes que enriquecen estos espacios. Entonces, muchísimas gracias a todos. Cualquier cosa que necesiten, pues Katy nos ha compartido su email por el chat, y también se pueden comunicar conmigo, Elsa Escalante, coordinadora de la Maestría en Educación. Mi correo es escalante@uninorte.edu.co, y allí también si necesitan algo, pues pueden contar con nosotros. Entonces, muchísimas gracias a todos, y estén pendientes de las masterclass de la Maestría en Educación, modalidad investigativa, en donde ustedes podrán participar y hacer parte de nuestro programa. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, Katy.
Thank
Gracias, Katy. Thank you very much, Katy, for your efforts. I was just saying that we are very happy to have all these people today who provide very nice feedback and thoughts, and it was very nice to have this experience, and they are free to have this experience again with the other classes. And in fact, Kathy, you have been with us twice, and I hope you continue with us working on these interesting topics about education and childhood. So thank you very much, and we will keep you in touch.
Okay, sounds good. Have a
Okay.
nice night.
Have a nice night.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.